Sealed court records from St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, revealed testimony that was deliberately suppressed for 73 years. 26 women, ranging in age from 14 to 38, described identical underground chambers beneath what appeared to be ordinary plantation storage cellars. Each account mentioned the same architectural details: brick archways barely 5 feet high, iron rings embedded in limestone walls at precise intervals, and wooden examination tables with leather restraints worn smooth from decades of use. What makes these testimonies particularly disturbing is not what these women endured, but what they were forced to produce. Medical records discovered in 1934 documented systematic procedures that turned human beings into commodities through methods that violated every principle of decency, yet remained entirely legal under Louisiana law until 1865. The architects of this system left behind detailed ledgers, breeding charts, and correspondence with similar operations across 7 southern states. Before we continue with the story of Belmont Plantation and the carefully calculated horror that unfolded beneath its manicured lawns, consider that what you're about to hear was not the work of a single madman, but a lucrative business model shared among Louisiana's wealthiest families. If you're listening from Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere in the Deep South, leave a comment telling us your state or city. Your perspective on this dark chapter of American history matters, and please subscribe to Circle of Fear 1 because stories like this need to be remembered, not buried. The systematic nature of what happened at Belmont forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about antebellum economics, one that goes beyond the already horrific realities of slavery, into territory that most historians prefer to discuss only in clinical terms. St. Landry Parish in 1837 represented the apex of Louisiana's cotton economy. The region's alluvial soil produced yields that made plantation owners among the wealthiest men in North America. Belmont Plantation, established in 1791 by the DeVoe family, sprawled across 40 acres along Bayou-Teche. The main house, a stunning example of Creole architecture with wide galleries and Doric columns, proclaimed the family's status to anyone traveling the river road. By the late 1830s, Belmont was owned by Augustine and DeVoe Roman III, a 47-year-old widower whose business acumen was respected throughout the parish. Unlike many plantation owners who left daily operations to overseers, Augustin maintained meticulous control over every aspect of Belmont. He kept detailed records, corresponded with agricultural societies, and served on the parish police jury. His neighbors considered him a model of efficiency and propriety. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 137 souls in 1837. Unlike some neighboring estates that suffered high mortality rates and constant runaways, Belmont's enslaved community appeared remarkably stable. The Sunday market at nearby Opelousas drew comments on how well-fed and healthy Belmont's people seemed compared to those from other plantations. Augustine's reputation for good management of his human property was discussed at gentlemen's clubs and agricultural meetings as something to be emulated. What made this reputation particularly significant was Belmont's unusual profitability. While other plantations struggled with the economic realities of maintaining a large enslaved workforce, the constant need to purchase new workers to replace those who died or became too old to work productively, Belmont seemed to grow its workforce internally at a rate that defied standard calculations. Between 1825 and 1845, the plantation's enslaved population nearly doubled without significant purchases at auction. The plantation's physical layout reflected traditional Louisiana architecture. The main house sat elevated on brick pillars surrounded by dependencies. The kitchen building, Gassier Overseer's house, and a schoolhouse where Augustine's 3 daughters received their education. Further from the main house stood the quarters arranged in 2 neat rows of whitewashed cabins. The sugar mill, cotton press, and various storage buildings occupied the industrial area near the river landing. But it was the root cellar complex, built into the slight elevation behind the main house, that distinguished Bellamont from neighboring plantations. Augustine had extensively renovated these underground chambers in 1828, ostensibly to create ideal storage conditions for the plantation's wine collection and provisions. The project took 8 months and employed skilled brickmasons from New Orleans. Neighbors admired the resulting structure's clever ventilation system and temperature stability. No one questioned why such an elaborate cellar complex required 3 separate entrances, or why it was built with walls 3 ft thick. The explanations Augustine provided, controlling humidity, preventing spoilage, protecting valuable stores, satisfied the curious. After all, a man of his wealth and sophistication would naturally want the finest facilities for his extensive wine collection and imported goods. The enslaved community at Bellarmine lived under a regime that appeared on the surface less brutal than many neighboring plantations. The rations were adequate, the clothing provided regularly, and medical attention given by a physician who visited monthly. Sunday afternoons allowed time for family, worship, and small garden plots. This comparative leniency generated its own form of control. Bellamont's enslaved people knew their situation could be far worse. Other plantations were known for vicious overseers, starvation rations, and brutal punishments. The threat of being sold to such places hung over anyone who might consider resistance. Yet certain patterns were visible to those who looked carefully. Young women, particularly those between ages 15 and 25, disappeared from fieldwork with unusual frequency. The official explanation was that they were being trained for house service or specialized tasks. They would vanish for weeks or months, then return to appear in the quarters, often pregnant. Some women went through this cycle multiple times. The community whispered among themselves, but the fear of separation and sale kept questions unspoken in the presence of white authority. Marie Trosclair arrived at Belmo in March 1837, purchased at the New Orleans slave market for the substantial sum of $800. At 19, she possessed qualities that made her valuable: literacy in French and English, training as a seamstress, and what the bill of sale described as excellent breeding potential. Her previous owner, a widow settling debts in the city, had treated her household slaves with relative kindness. Marie expected her new situation might be comparable. Her first weeks at Bellamont reinforced this hope. She was assigned to the sewing house, a comfortable building where she worked alongside 3 other women making clothing for the plantation. The work was skilled and indoors, far preferable to field labor. Augustine's daughters even complimented her needlework. Marie began to believe she might build something resembling a life here, might eventually marry one of the skilled craftsmen among the enslaved population, might have children who could learn trades rather than spend their lives chopping cotton. Then, on a humid evening in late April, the overseer, a lean man named Virgil Landry, came to the sewing house after the other women had left. He carried a lantern and spoke in the formal, careful tone that white men used when issuing orders that brooked no discussion. "Master Dio requires your presence in the main house cellar. Bring nothing. Come with me now." The walk from the sewing house to the main residence took less than 5 minutes. But Marie's mind raced through possibilities. Had she done something wrong? Was she being punished? Sold away already? The evening was still light enough that other enslaved people were visible returning from their tasks, but none met her eyes as Landry led her past the main house to the hillside structure behind it. The entrance was a heavy oak door set into the earth, reinforced with iron straps. Landry produced a key from his vest and unlocked it, gesturing for Marie to descend the brick steps that disappeared into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and carried an odd smell, medicinal almost, mixed with something organic she couldn't identify. "Keep moving," Landry said behind her, his lantern casting their shadows long against the brick walls. The stairs descended about 12 ft before opening into a corridor. The ceiling was low, forcing Marie to duck slightly. The walls were expertly laid brick, the floor smooth limestone. Oil lamps in wall sconces provided steady light. The corridor extended about 30 feet before reaching a heavy door. Through that door lay a chamber that defied everything Marie understood about plantation architecture. The room was perhaps 20 ft square with a ceiling reinforced by brick arches. Along one wall stood shelves holding medical instruments, bottles of various liquids, and neatly labeled jars. In the center of the room sat a peculiar piece of furniture, something between an examination table and a restraining device made of polished wood with leather straps at various points. But what drew Marie's attention was the woman already in the room. Hélène, one of the house servants, stood near the wall wearing only a thin shift. She was perhaps 25, her belly swollen with pregnancy in its late stages. Her face was carefully blank, the expression of someone who had learned not to react. Augustin Deveau stood near a small desk, writing in a leather-bound ledger. He looked up as Marie entered, and his expression was business-like, almost clinical. "Marie, you come with excellent references regarding your intelligence and health. What you are about to learn is the source of Bellam's prosperity. You will cooperate fully, or you will be sold to the Sunnier Plantation in Ayles Parish, where I understand the mortality rate for field workers is quite remarkable. Do you understand?" Marie nodded, her throat too tight for speech. "Good. Helen here is about to deliver her 4th child for Belmore. You will assist Dr. Prudhomme, who will arrive shortly. This will be your introduction to your new primary duty." Over the next several hours, Marie learned the truth about Bellamont's unusual profitability. The plantation was not merely using enslaved women's reproductive capacity naturally. It was systematically managing it with scientific precision. Dr. Prudhomme, a thin man in his 60s with ink-stained fingers, explained the process with the detached tone of a professor discussing agricultural breeding. Young women of good health and physique were selected at around 15 or 16. They were brought to the basement chambers and examined thoroughly. Measurements taken, physical characteristics documented, health assessed. Then, they were assigned to one of several enslaved men chosen specifically for desirable traits, height, strength, even temperament or particular skills. The pairings were documented in extensive charts that tracked lineage across multiple generations. The women lived in a separate section of the quarters, receiving superior rations heavy in protein and milk. Their pregnancies were monitored carefully with Dr. Prudhomme visiting weekly. They gave birth in the basement chambers under conditions far more sanitary than typical plantation births. The resulting children were meticulously documented, every physical characteristic, every sign of health or weakness recorded. The boys would be raised to become skilled laborers or breeders themselves. The girls would enter the program at 15. Within a single generation, Augustine had created a population of enslaved people custom designed for specific purposes. Field workers with exceptional endurance, house servants with particular physical appearances, craftsmen with inherited aptitudes. But the true genius of the system, Augustine explained to Marie that night with evident pride, was in the economics. A healthy female in the program could produce 8 to 10 children during her prime years, at market prices of $600 to $1,000 per child by age 10. Each woman represented a return of $5 to $8,000. Subtract costs of upkeep and medical care, and the profit margin exceeded that of cotton by a significant factor. "Cotton wears out the soil," Augustine said, sipping brandy as Dr. Prudhomme cleaned his instruments, "but this is renewable wealth, self-generating capital. Several plantations in the parish have adopted similar systems after seeing my results. We are in essence creating an entirely new economic model." Marie's role, she learned, would be multifaceted. Her literacy made her valuable for maintaining the breeding records. Her needlework skills would be employed creating the special garments used during pregnancies, and given her own health and characteristics, she would herself enter the program within the month. The selection of her pairing was described to her with the same careful consideration one might use, discussing the mating of prize horses. After reviewing his charts and consulting his records, Augustine decided she would be paired with a blacksmith named Cyrus, a man of 32 who had already sired 7 healthy children through the program. The combination of Marie's intelligence and Cyrus's physical strength might, Augustine theorized, produce children of exceptional value. That night, Returning to her cabin in the quarters, Marie understood she had entered a nightmare with no escape. She could refuse, but refusal meant sail to a plantation where life expectancy for field workers rarely exceeded 7 years. She could run, but Louisiana law was merciless toward runaways, and the penalties extended to anyone who might have helped her. She could resist, but resistance would simply mean she would be restrained during the procedures Augustine had planned. The other women in the program had already learned these calculations. Over the following weeks, Marie met them. 17 women of various ages, all sharing the particular look of those who had learned to separate themselves psychologically from what was happening to their bodies. They spoke in quiet voices about strategies for survival, how to maintain dignity when dignity was being systematically stripped away, how to love children who would never fully belong to you, how to endure the monthly examinations and the forced pairings and the constant documentation of your body's functions. The oldest woman in the program, a 38-year-old named Claudette, had been part of the system since its inception in 1828. She had given birth to 9 children, only 3 of whom remained at Belmore. The others had been sold at around age 10 when their value peaked. Claudette spoke of them with a carefully controlled grief that never quite showed on her face. You learn to love them in the moment. She told Marie during one of their supervised work sessions in the basement sewing room, a chamber adjacent to the medical area where the women created clothing for themselves and their children. You love them completely while you have them, and then when Master decides it's time for them to go, you learn to lock that love away in a place where it can't destroy you. You survive by becoming 2 people, the woman who loves her children and the woman who understands they were never truly yours. The basement complex, Marie discovered, was far more extensive than that first chamber suggested. A network of rooms served different purposes. The medical examination room, the delivery room, the nursery where infants stayed for their first months, the sewing room, a small kitchen for preparing the specialized diets the pregnant women received, and even a classroom where the children received basic instruction until age 6. The system operated with remarkable efficiency. Augustine maintained records that would have impressed any agricultural society. He tracked conception rates, birth weights, infant mortality, childhood development milestones, adult health outcomes, and the eventual sale prices of those children he chose to market. He corresponded with other plantation owners experimenting with similar programs, sharing data and discussing methods for improving outcomes. His filing cabinets contained drawings that showed optimal positioning during conception, schedules for maximum fertility, dietary regimens for pregnant women, and treatment protocols for various complications. He had essentially created an industrial process for human reproduction, removing every element of chance or individual choice. Marie's first pairing occurred 3 weeks after her arrival. She was brought to a small chamber she hadn't seen before, perhaps 10 ft square, furnished only with a bed and a small table holding a lamp. Cyrus was already there, looking as uncomfortable as she felt. They were left alone with instructions that were both explicit and humiliating. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Cyrus spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and carried an accent from the Georgia coast where he'd been born. "This ain't who I am," he said quietly. "What we just done, that wasn't me choosing you, and it wasn't you choosing me. We both just trying to survive. You understand that?" Marie nodded in the darkness, grateful for the acknowledgement of their shared helplessness. "I got 7 children I helped make this way," Cyrus continued. "I don't know where 5 of them are now. One's here working in the fields, old enough now that Master considers him productive. One's just a baby, lives in the nursery downstairs. The others sold off when Master needed cash or made trades with other plantations." He paused, and Marie heard the careful control in his voice. "I tell myself I'm keeping them alive by cooperating. If I refuse, Master just picks another man and I get sold or worse. If I fight, it changes nothing except maybe I end up dead. So I do what I'm told, and I try to remember that the children exist, even if I can't be their father in any real way." This conversation, whispered in the darkness of that terrible room, was the first of many. The enslaved people caught in Augustine's system developed their own community, their own ways of maintaining humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. They learned each other's stories, remembered the children who were sold away, marked birthdays and small celebrations when they could, but they also learned to navigate the constant surveillance and documentation. Augustine's system required their cooperation, and he had perfected a combination of incentives and threats that made resistance nearly impossible. Women in the program received better food, lighter work, and the promise that their children would be trained for skilled positions rather than field labor. The men selected as breeders received similar considerations, better quarters, additional rations, and the implicit threat that refusal would mean not just their own suffering, but the selection of other men for the role. The medical aspects of the program were overseen by Dr. Prudhomme with a thoroughness that might have been admirable in another context. He monitored the women's monthly cycles, calculated optimal timing for conception, and prescribed specific herbs and treatments to increase fertility. When pregnancies occurred, he documented every stage with careful measurements and observations. The delivery room represented the system's strange contradictions. Augustine invested in conditions far superior to typical plantation births. The room was clean, well lit, and equipped with medical instruments. Dr. Prud attended every delivery personally, applying techniques he'd learned from European medical journals. He used chloroform for particularly difficult births, employed antiseptic methods that significantly reduced infection rates, and provided post-delivery care that actually prioritized the mother's survival. This wasn't mercy, it was economics. A dead mother represented a significant loss of capital, and maternal mortality reduced the efficiency of the entire system. Augustine's records showed that Belmont's maternal mortality rate was actually lower than the parish average, a statistic he noted with evident pride in his correspondence with other plantation owners. Marie's first pregnancy, confirmed by Dr. Prudhomme in July 1837, brought her into the full reality of the system. She was moved to the basement complex, given a private room roughly 8 ft square with a narrow bed, a small table, and a chamber pot. She shared a common area with the other pregnant women, a space with several chairs, a table and shelves holding books that Augustine provided. The women were encouraged to read, to maintain their health, to avoid stress that might complicate their pregnancies. The routine was carefully structured. Mornings began with breakfast brought down by one of the house servants. Food far superior to standard slave rations heavy in eggs, milk, and meat. After eating, the women would work on sewing projects, creating clothing for themselves and the children. Dr. Prudhomme visited every Thursday, conducting examinations that were thorough and humiliating. Each woman's progress was documented in the ledgers: weight gain, measurements, fetal position, any concerns or complications. Afternoons allowed for supervised walks in a small courtyard behind the main house, an area screened from view by carefully placed hedges. The women would walk in circles, their swelling bellies marking their purpose, their faces carefully composed to show no emotion. Evening brought more handwork, light reading if they chose, and eventually sleep in their tiny rooms. The isolation was deliberate. Augustine didn't want the women forming bonds that might lead to coordinated resistance. Conversations were monitored by the house servants who brought their meals and supplies. Any discussion that seemed to trend toward planning or resistance was quickly reported and resulted in immediate consequences: reduced rations, confinement to their rooms, or threats of sale after delivery. Yet the women still found ways to communicate through glances and quiet words during their supervised walks, through notes hidden in sewing projects, through whispered conversations during the chaos of deliveries when supervision was less stringent. They shared strategies for maintaining sanity, meditation techniques, memories to retreat into, ways of mentally separating themselves from what was happening to their bodies. Claudette, the veteran of the system, became something of a mentor to Marie and the other younger women. She taught them how to respond to Dr. Prudhomme's examinations, cooperative but emotionally absent, giving him no satisfaction beyond the clinical data he sought. She explained how to navigate Augustine's periodic visits, He would come down to inspect the women monthly, checking on his investments with the same careful attention he gave his cotton crops. "Never meet his eyes," Claudette advised. "Look past him, through him. He wants you to acknowledge his power, his control. Don't give him that. You keep your mind somewhere else, somewhere he can't touch. You think about the person you were before this, or the person you might be after. You stay alive inside your head, even when he owns everything else." Marie gave birth to a daughter in April 1838. The labor lasted 19 hours and was attended by Dr. Prudhomme, 2 midwives from the quarters, and Augustine himself, who observed while making notes in his ever-present ledger. The baby was healthy, 7 lb 60 by the doctor's careful measurement. She had Marie's facial features and what appeared to be Cyrus's robust constitution. Augustine examined the infant with evident satisfaction, noting various characteristics in his records. "Strong bone structure," he commented, "good lung capacity based on the strength of her cry, likely to develop into a valuable house servant or breeder herself in 12 to 15 years. I'll call her Desiree. She's exactly what I hoped this pairing would produce." Marie held her daughter for perhaps an hour before the infant was taken to the nursery. She would be allowed to nurse the baby on a strict schedule every 4 hours, monitored by one of the midwives. But otherwise the child would be raised communally by enslaved women too old for fieldwork, who served as nurses. The separation was immediate and absolute. Augustine had learned from earlier experiments that allowing mothers to bond too closely with their children led to resistance and emotional instability that reduced future fertility. Marie returned to the pairing rotation 3 months after delivery. Augustine's records indicated that nursing women were less likely to conceive, so she was paired with Cyrus again for monthly sessions timed to her cycle. The clinical precision of the entire process, the scheduled encounters, the monitored nursing, the documented recovery turned human reproduction into something more akin to industrial manufacturing. By 1840, Belmont's basement complex housed 23 women in various stages of pregnancy or recovery. The system had expanded to include a crude filing system tracking lineage across 3 generations. Augustine could identify which pairings produced children with desired characteristics and adjust his breeding protocols accordingly. He'd discovered, for instance, that children born from pairings between lighter-skinned enslaved people commanded premium prices in the New Orleans market, where they were often purchased for house service in elite establishments. This led to another layer of dehumanization. Augustine began documenting skin tone with the same precision he applied to physical measurements. He created a scale of gradations and began deliberately pairing people to produce children of specific complexions. The correspondence in his files included letters to plantation owners offering to trade enslaved men of particular characteristics, discussing human genetics with the same casual attention others might give to discussing cotton seeds or cattle breeding. The system's existence wasn't entirely secret. Some neighbors knew or suspected what was happening beneath Belmont's manicured grounds, but within the moral framework of antebellum Louisiana, Augustine's activities, while extreme, weren't particularly shocking. He was simply taking to its logical conclusion the premise that enslaved people were property to be managed for maximum return. Several other plantation owners visited Belmont to study his methods, and at least 3 adopted similar systems on their own estates. The enslaved community at Belmont knew, of course, the women in the program lived separately, disappeared into the basement complex for months at a time, and emerged with infants who were taken from them. The rest of the enslaved population whispered about it in the quarters at night, but the fear of being sold to worse conditions kept any thought of organized resistance suppressed. Some of the older enslaved people, those who remembered earlier less systematized brutality, argued that at least the women in the program were well-fed and not subjected to the random violence that characterized other plantations. This rationalization that systematic exploitation was preferable to chaotic cruelty became its own form of control. Augustine deliberately created conditions that made the enslaved community complicit in their own oppression by treating those in the breeding program marginally better than field workers. He ensured that selection for the program was viewed by some as preferable to the alternatives. By keeping the women isolated from each other and from the broader community, he prevented the formation of resistance networks. Marie's second pregnancy occurred in late 1840. This time, Augustine tried a different pairing, choosing a man named Thomas, who had demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability. The calculation was explicit. Marie's literacy combined with Thomas's numerical aptitude might produce children capable of serving as bookkeepers or clerk positions that commanded high prices in urban slave markets. The pregnancy proceeded normally until the 7th month, when Marie developed complications that Dr. Prudhomme diagnosed as eclampsia. Her survival was uncertain for several weeks, kept alive through methods that were advanced for the era. Careful management of her diet, enforced rest, and close monitoring. The baby, a boy, was delivered premature at 8 months and survived only 3 days. Augustine recorded the loss with obvious displeasure, noting in his ledger the financial impact of the failed pregnancy and Marie's medical expenses, but he also documented the medical details carefully, sharing the information with Dr. Prudhomme as they refined their protocols to prevent similar complications in future pregnancies. Marie's recovery took 4 months, during which she was kept in the basement complex, but not included in the pairing rotation. During this period, she was assigned to full-time record-keeping, updating the breeding ledgers with new births, recording characteristics of children as they developed, and maintaining the filing system that tracked the entire operation. This work gave Marie access to the full scope of what Augustine had created. The records showed 31 women had participated in the program since its inception in 1828. Between them, they had delivered 19 live births. 87 of those children survived past age 5. 43 had been sold at various ages, generating documented revenue of $31,400. The remaining children either worked at Bell or had died from various causes. The ledgers also revealed Augustine's expansion plans. He had begun purchasing young enslaved women specifically for the program, seeking out those with characteristics he desired: health, intelligence, particular physical features. He'd established correspondence with slave traders in Virginia, who supplied him with women from Upper South estates, where natural increase had created surplus populations. But the records also contained something else: small notations in code that Marie gradually deciphered. Augustine was documenting not just births and characteristics, but also patterns of resistance which women attempted to induce miscarriages, which became uncooperative after multiple pregnancies, which showed signs of what he termed emotional instability. These women were marked for sale, typically to plantation owners Augustine knew worked their field laborers to death within a few years. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the system, the thoroughness with which Augustine had thought through every element of human response and developed countermeasures. He had anticipated resistance and built in mechanisms to eliminate it. He had considered the psychological toll of the program and created structures to manage it. He had turned the production of human beings into a science, documented and refined through years of experimentation. In 1842, Belmont's system faced its first serious challenge. An enslaved woman named Jolene, pregnant with her third child through the program, managed to smuggle a letter to a Catholic priest during a rare visit he made to the plantation to conduct baptisms. The letter, written in clumsy French, described the basement complex and begged for intervention. The priest, Father Antoine Mirier, was horrified by what he read, but he also understood the realities of Louisiana law and social structure. What Augustine was doing, while morally reprehensible, violated no statutes. Enslaved people had no legal right to control their own reproduction. The Catholic Church officially opposed the separation of enslaved families, but that position carried no legal weight in civil matters. Father Mercier did the only thing he could. He confronted Augustine, and directly visiting Belmont to express his concerns. The conversation, as August recorded it in his diary, was revealing. The priest argued from moral and theological grounds that the breeding program violated human dignity and the sanctity of family. Augustine countered with economic and legal arguments, pointing out that slavery itself was based on the premise that enslaved people were property, and that managing the reproduction of one's property was an owner's prerogative. The discussion ended with a compromise that changed nothing fundamental about the system. Austin agreed that children born in the breeding program would not be sold before age 12, allowing for longer periods of contact with their mothers. He also agreed to permit Father Mercier to visit the plantation quarterly to provide religious instruction and conduct baptisms. In exchange, the priest agreed to take no further action to expose or interfere with the program. This accommodation satisfied Father Mercier's conscience, while allowing Augustin to continue his operations with minimal modification. The age change actually worked in Augustin's favor. Waiting until age 12 to sell children meant they could be trained in specific skills that increased their value. A 12-year-old who could read, write, and perform arithmetic commanded significantly more at auction than an untrained 10-year-old. Marie witnessed this negotiation from her position maintaining the records. She saw how systems of power protected themselves, how even those who claimed moral objections ultimately accommodated themselves to atrocity when confrontation became too costly. Father Mercier's quarterly visits brought some comfort to the women in the program, a sympathetic ear, the rituals of faith, a connection to something beyond the basement complex. But his presence also legitimized the system, giving it a veneer of religious sanction that made resistance seem even more hopeless. By 1845, Marie had given birth to 3 more children, all by different pairings selected by Augustine. She had learned to exist in a state of emotional suspension, performing her duties, maintaining the records while mentally separating herself from the reality those records documented. She knew the names and characteristics of every child born in the program, tracked their development and eventual fates, and maintained the filing system that made the entire operation possible. The children she had born, Desiree, now 7, Jean-Baptiste, 5, and the twins, Céline and Claire, 3, were raised in the nursery complex. Marie saw them during Father Mercier's visits and occasionally during supervised time in the courtyard. They called her Marie rather than Mother as instructed. They had been taught from infancy that they belonged to Master Dur, that their purpose was to serve profitably. That attachment to any particular adult was discouraged. Daisy Ray, showing signs of her mother's intelligence and her father's physical strength, was already being trained for house service. Augustine planned to place her in his daughter's service within a few years, teaching her the skills that would make her valuable as a lady's maid when his daughters eventually married. The girl's future, serving other white families, possibly bearing children through similar programs if her future owners chose, was already mapped out in Augustine's long-term planning documents. The twins showed different aptitudes. Céline was developing musical talent, picking out tunes on the piano when the children were brought to the main house for display to visitors. Augustine was already calculating the premium he could charge for a musically trained enslaved child. Claire showed less obvious talents, but possessed the lighter complexion and refined features that commanded high prices in urban markets. Jean-Baptiste, in contrast, was developing into exactly what Augustine had hoped from Marie's pairing with Thomas. The boy showed remarkable facility with numbers, able to perform calculations in his head that impressed even Dr. Prudhomme. Augustine planned to train him as a clerk, possibly hiring him out to other plantation owners or businesses in Opelousas, generating steady rental income while retaining ownership. Watching her children develop into commodities whose value could be calculated and optimized was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Marie's situation. She could see their personalities emerging, their individual quirks and talents, but she also saw how those characteristics were immediately assessed for their market potential. Every trait was documented, analyzed, and incorporated into Augustine's breeding calculations for future generations. The system's expansion continued through the 1840s. By 1848, Augustine was operating what amounted to an industrial breeding program. The basement complex had been expanded twice, now including 32 individual rooms, 3 delivery chambers, an enlarged nursery, and additional workspace. The enslaved population had grown to 214, with 73 of those births occurring through the breeding program. Austin's reputation as a successful plantation manager had spread throughout Louisiana and into neighboring states. He received regular inquiries from other owners seeking advice on implementing similar systems. His ledgers recorded consulting fees paid by planters from Mississippi, Alabama, and even South Carolina, who visited Belmont to study his methods. These visitors would tour the facilities, the immaculate records, the well-organized nursery, the healthy appearance of the women in the program, and express admiration for the system's efficiency. The moral dimensions of what they were witnessing seemed not to occur to them, or if they did, were dismissed as sentimentality inappropriate to business considerations. One visitor, a planter from Natchez named Horace Sterling, recorded his impressions in a letter that later surfaced in historical archives. Mr. DeVoe has perfected what others have attempted in crude fashion by applying principles of animal husbandry to the management of colored populations. He has created a self-sustaining labor force that requires minimal external purchase. The attention to detail is remarkable. Every aspect from nutrition to medical care is optimized for reproductive efficiency. The initial capital investment is substantial, but the returns over 20 years far exceed traditional cotton cultivation. I have determined to implement a similar program at Morningside. This letter and others like it documented how Augustine's model spread across the Deep South in the 1840s and early 1850s. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 15 plantations in Louisiana alone adopted systematic breeding programs based on Belmont's example. The practice likely occurred on many more estates, but without Augustine's obsessive documentation. The human cost of this expansion was documented only in the scattered records that survived. Women trapped in these programs across multiple plantations, their lives reduced to reproductive capacity. Children raised in nurseries designed to prevent emotional attachment, prepared from birth for sale or exploitation. Men forced to participate in creating children they would never raise, their fatherhood reduced to genetic material. Families destroyed before they could even form. Marie, now 30 years old in 1848, had been part of the system for 11 years. She had given birth to 7 children, 4 of whom survived past infancy. Desiree, now 10, had been assigned to serve Augustine's eldest daughter, learning the skills that might make her valuable when that daughter eventually married and established her own household. The other surviving children were being trained for various specialized roles that would maximize their value. But Marie had also used her position maintaining the records to document everything. Over the years, she had kept a separate accounting, not just the clinical details Augustine required, but names, stories, connections. She knew which children belonged to which mothers, tracked the women who had passed through the system, recorded the sales and separations that Augustine documented so casually in his ledgers. She had no plan for what to do with this information. There was no legal avenue for challenging the system, no outside authority that would intervene on behalf of enslaved people. But some instinct for justice, some need to ensure that what was happening would be remembered, drove her to maintain this parallel record in cramped handwriting on scraps of paper she hid beneath the floorboards of her small room. In 1850, everything changed, though not in the way Marie might have hoped. Austin, now 60 years old, suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to continue his direct management of the plantation. His eldest daughter, Marguerite, had married a New Orleans merchant named Phipe Swallow, and the couple moved to Belmore to assume control of the estate. Philippe was 28, ambitious, and eager to prove himself capable of managing the substantial property he'd acquired through marriage. Unlike Augusta, who had developed his system over decades of careful experimentation, Philippe viewed the breeding program primarily as a source of liquid capital. He immediately began selling children at younger ages, 8, 9, 10 years old, to generate cash for expanding Belmont's cotton operations. This acceleration of the system's cruelty sparked the resistance that had been suppressed for so long. The women in the program, who had endured years of systematic exploitation, found the removal of even the minimal protections Augustine had maintained: children not sold before 12, reasonable spacing between pregnancies, adequate medical care to be the breaking point. Claudette, now 51, and considered too old for the breeding program, but retained for her sewing skills, became the nucleus of resistance. She had survived the system's entire existence, had borne 11 children over 23 years, had watched 9 of them sold away. Philip's decision to sell her remaining 2 children, boys of 11 and 9 who still lived at Belmore, triggered something in her that 23 years of carefully controlled survival had suppressed. Over several months in late 1850, Claudette began building a network among the women in the program and the broader enslaved community. The communication was careful, coded in the language of sewing instructions and Bible verses that Father Mirier had taught them. The plan that emerged was not escape. That was impossible for women with children with pregnancies with tracking systems that would lead to their recapture within days. Instead, they planned documentation and exposure. Marie's hidden records became central to this plan. Between them, Marie and Claude, it began creating a comprehensive account of the breeding program. Names, dates, children born, children sold, the medical procedures, the pairings, everything. They wrote in careful French on paper stolen from the record, keeping supplies, hiding the documents in the one place. Philippe and his overseer never thoroughly searched inside the mattress ticking up the delivery room beds. The plan was to somehow get these documents to Father Mirier or to another sympathetic outsider who might use them to expose the system. It was a desperate hope based on the slim chance that public exposure might shame Phipe into ending the program, or at least moderating its worst aspects. But before they could execute this plan, they were betrayed. One of the house servants, a young woman named Nichelet, who had been promised freedom from the breeding program if she reported resistance, revealed the plot to Phipe. The retribution was swift and brutal. Philippe gathered the entire enslaved population in the yard before the main house on a cold morning in January 1851. Claudette was brought out in chains, her face bruised from the beating she'd received. Marie was forced to stand beside her, also chained. Philip's speech was brief and calculated. He held up the hidden documents, describing them as evidence of a conspiracy to steal plantation records and forge papers for escape. The actual content of the documents, the detailed accounting of the breeding program, he didn't mention. That truth couldn't be acknowledged publicly, even as he punished those who had documented it. Claude, it was sold the next day to a cotton factor Phipe knew in Ayoyal Parish, a man whose plantation was notorious for working field laborers to death within 3 to 4 years. Claude, its 2 remaining children were sold separately to different buyers, ensuring she would never know what became of them. Marie, because her literacy made her valuable for maintaining records, was not sold, but was removed from record-keeping duties and placed into the pairing rotation full-time. The other women, suspected of involvement in the documentation effort, were subjected to various punishments: separation from their children, assignment to field work despite pregnancies, reduction of rations, and implied threats of sale to worse situations. The message was clear: resistance would be met with consequences that extended beyond the individual to their children and anyone they cared about. Philippe also made changes to the physical system. The basement complex was reorganized to increase surveillance. A house servant was assigned to live in the complex full-time, monitoring the women's activities and conversations. The courtyard walks were eliminated. Books were removed from the common area. The women were to have no occupation beyond their assigned sewing work, and no opportunity for conversation that wasn't supervised. Father Mirier, when he arrived for his next quarterly visit, was informed that the women were unavailable for his religious instruction. An illness, Philippe claimed, that made gathering them unsafe. The priest accepted this explanation, and his visits to Belmont became increasingly perfunctory. Within a year, he stopped coming at all. The suppression of resistance and the destruction of documentation might have been the end of the story. But Philip's expansion of the breeding program and his aggressive sales of its products drew attention that Augustine's more careful management had avoided. By 1853, Belmont was selling 3 to 4 children per year at the New Orleans slave market, and the pattern, children of similar ages, excellent health, specialized training, began attracting notice from people opposed to slavery. An abolitionist newspaper in New York obtained information about Belmont's unusual production of premium enslaved children and published an article suggesting systematic breeding operations on southern plantations. The article was sensationalized and lacked specific details, but it prompted investigations by northern religious organizations and even some concern among moderate Southerners who found the explicit treatment of human reproduction as industrial manufacture distasteful. Philip responded by becoming more secretive about his operations. Sales were spread across multiple markets and conducted through intermediaries. The basement complex was accessed only through the main house behind locked doors, with no external evidence of its existence. Visitors to Belmont were shown the cotton operations, the impressive main house, the well-maintained quarters, but never the underground chambers where the breeding program continued. By 1860, as sectional tensions pushed the nation toward war, Belmont's breeding program had produced its third generation. Children who had been born in the system were now adults, some of them selected for the program themselves. The genetic charts Augustine had begun were now extensive enough to track hereditary traits across multiple generations. Something that fascinated Philip from a purely commercial standpoint. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted but didn't immediately end the system. Louisiana fell under Union control relatively early in the war, with New Orleans occupied in 1862, but St. Landry Parish, in the heart of Louisiana's Plantation Belt, remained under Confederate authority until late in the war. During these years, Philip struggled to maintain the program as the plantation's economy collapsed. Cotton couldn't be sold, and the cash flow that had funded the breeding operations costs dried up. By 1863, the women in the program were receiving rations no better than field workers. Medical care became sporadic. Dr. Prudhomme, elderly and in poor health, died in 1863 and was not replaced. Marie survived the war years through a combination of luck and her continued usefulness, maintaining what remained of the plantation's records. She was now 43, past the age for the breeding program, but valuable for her literacy and organizational skills. As Belmont's systems fell apart, she became responsible for documenting the plantation's collapse, tracking which enslaved people had fled to Union lines, which remained, what resources still existed. The end came in April 1865. Union troops occupied St. Landry Parish and federal officials arrived at plantations to announce emancipation and begin registration of formerly enslaved people. Marie was among those who gave testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau agents about conditions at Belmont, but her testimony and that of the other women from the breeding program was not recorded in detail. The Freedmen's Bureau agents, overwhelmed with the task of managing newly freed populations across the entire South, treated plantation breeding programs as just another aspect of slavery's general brutality. They documented that children had been sold, that families had been separated, that women had been forced to bear children, but they didn't capture the systematic, multi-generational, scientifically managed nature of what had occurred at Belmont. The breeding program's documentary evidence, Augustine's careful records, Philip's ledgers, Marie's hidden accounts were largely destroyed. Philip, before fleeing to New Orleans as Union troops approached, burned most of the basement complex's records. Some documents survived, scattered among various archives, but the full scope of what had occurred would not be pieced together for decades. Marie spent the remaining years of her life in Opelousas, working as a seamstress and attempting to locate the children who had been sold away from Belmo. She found 3 of her 7 children, Daisy Ray, now living in New Orleans and working as a domestic servant; Jane Baptiste, who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi and made his way back to Louisiana after the war; and one of the twins, Claire, who had been sold to a New Orleans household and gained some education. The other 4 children, including one twin, Celine, she never located. They existed in Augustine's carefully documented records, their births and characteristics noted, their sale prices recorded, but their ultimate fates disappeared into the chaos of war and emancipation. Marie searched for them until her death in 1879, placing advertisements in newspapers, writing to Freeriedman's bureau offices across the South, following every lead that might reunite her with children whose births she had been forced to produce. The other women from Belmont's breeding program scattered across Louisiana and beyond after emancipation. Some, like Marie, stayed in the area, attempting to rebuild lives and locate lost children. Others fled, wanting nothing that might remind them of the years spent in the basement complex. The community they had formed, the whispered conversations, the shared strategies for survival, the mutual recognition of their particular form of suffering dissolved as they pursued individual paths toward freedom. In 1893, the St. Landry Parish Courthouse was preparing to demolish an old records building when a clerk discovered a water-damaged trunk containing documents from various plantations. Among them were fragments of Augustin Dieu's breeding records, perhaps 20 pages that had somehow escaped Philip's destruction. The clerk, a young man named Etienne Guidry, who had been born enslaved himself, recognized what he was reading and brought the documents to the attention of black community leaders in Apalwa. These leaders faced a difficult decision. Publishing the records would document a particularly horrifying aspect of slavery's systematic dehumanization, but it would also expose the intimate details of violations experienced by women who were still living, some of whom had tried to build new lives without the shadow of their enslavement defining them. The decision was made to seal the documents in the courthouse vault, with instructions that they not be opened without permission from the victims or their direct descendants. Additional testimony emerged in 1897 when a visiting historian from Boston interviewed elderly formerly enslaved people in St. Landry Parish for a project documenting slavery's legacies. 3 women who had been part of Belmont's breeding program gave recorded testimony. The first time their experiences were captured in their own words, rather than through the clinical documentation of their enslavers. These testimonies, preserved in the archives of the Boston Historical Society, describe the breeding program's operation in painful detail. They speak of the medical examinations, the forced pairings, the systematic separation from children, and the psychological strategies the women developed to survive. They also describe the aftermath, the decades spent searching for lost children, the difficulty of forming romantic relationships after years of systematized sexual exploitation, the nightmares and flashbacks that pursued them long after emancipation. One woman, Ellen Marshall, formerly enslaved at Belmore, now 72, told the historian, "People think freedom means you leave the past behind, but how do you leave behind children you bore? How do you forget years spent in rooms underground, your body used like a machine? I am free now. Yes, I own my labor, choose my life, walk where I please, but some part of me is still in that basement, still waiting for the next examination, still counting days between forced meetings with men I didn't choose. Freedom is supposed to heal everything, but there are wounds that stay open forever." Breeding program at Belmont was not unique. Historical research has identified at least 33 plantations across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, where similar systematic breeding operations occurred between 1820 and 1865. Augustin DeVoe's innovation was not the concept, but the thoroughness of documentation and the pseudoscientific approach he applied to what was already common practice. The economic incentive was straightforward. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, the value of enslaved people increased dramatically as the legal international slave trade ended. Natural increase became the primary source of new enslaved workers. Plantation owners who could efficiently produce healthy enslaved children for their own use or for sale possessed a significant economic advantage, but the human cost of this efficiency is incalculable. Thousands of women forced to bear children under systematic supervision. Tens of thousands of children raised from birth to understand themselves as commodities. Families prevented from forming or torn apart according to breeding charts and economic calculations. The psychological trauma extended across generations. Children born in these programs bore the mark of their origin throughout their lives and passed that legacy to their own descendants. The full scope of what occurred in places like Belmont's basement complex was deliberately obscured. The court records from St. Landry Parish contain only fragmentary references to the breeding program, and most of those focus on property disputes rather than the experiences of those enslaved. The destruction of documentation by former slaveholders after the war eliminated much of the direct evidence. Historians have had to piece together the story from scattered sources. Fragments of plantation records, Freary Edmunds Bureau testimonies, oral histories collected decades after emancipation, court cases involving property claims, and the few detailed accounts like those from Belmont. This systematic obscuring of evidence wasn't accidental. The people who operated breeding programs understood at some level that what they were doing would be condemned by history. Their destruction of records and suppression of testimony was an attempt to prevent future judgment. But enough evidence survived to document the reality that thousands of enslaved women experienced. The reduction of human reproduction to industrial process, managed with ledgers and charts and medical protocols that stripped away every element of choice, dignity, and human connection. Marie's hidden records discovered during the courthouse demolition provide one of the most detailed accountings of a breeding program's operations. Her careful documentation of names, births, characteristics, and sales created a record that resisted the erasure her enslavers attempted. When those records were finally opened to researchers in 1962, following permission from Marie's surviving descendants, they provided crucial evidence for understanding how systematic the exploitation of enslaved women's reproduction had become. The testimony, sealed in 1893, was finally released 73 years later in 1962 as part of the growing historical research into slavery's realities that accompanied the civil rights movement. By then, only one survivor of Belmont's breeding program remained alive, a 94-year-old woman living in California who had been born in the basement complex in 1868 during the program's final years. This woman, Louise Thiot, gave a recorded interview in 1963, a year before her death. She spoke about growing up knowing her mother had been forced to bear children for profit, about the difficulty of establishing her own identity separate from that origin, about the generational trauma that marked her family. She also spoke about resilience, how the community of people who had survived the breeding program and their descendants supported each other, created new families, built lives that affirmed their humanity in the face of systematic attempts to deny it. My mother told me, Louise recalled in that interview, that even in that basement, even while they were being treated as breeding stock, the women found ways to love their children, to pass on songs and stories, to maintain dignity that no one could take from them. That's what I remember most, not the horror of where I came from, but the strength of the women who survived it. They were more than what was done to them. We all are. This story, like all histories of systematic exploitation, demands remembering precisely because those who perpetrated it attempted erasure. The women who endured Belmont's breeding program deserved more than the clinical notation in ledgers or the brief mentions in court records. They deserve to have their experiences documented, their resistance acknowledged, their survival celebrated. Basement complex at Belmont was filled in during the 1890s when the property changed hands. The main house fell into disrepair and was demolished in the 1930s. Today, the site is agricultural land, showing no evidence of what occurred beneath its surface. But the record persists in archives, in testimonies, in the genealogical searches of descendants still trying to piece together families torn apart by systematic breeding programs. This history matters not because it represents the worst of slavery's horrors, though it certainly represents some of the most systematic dehumanization, but because it reveals the logic of treating human beings as property carried to its rational conclusion. Augustin Dio wasn't a monster apart from his society. He was a respected member of his community, applying techniques of animal husbandry to human beings because his legal and social system told him enslaved people were property to be managed for profit. The women who survived his system, who endured the forced pregnancies and systematized sexual exploitation and separation from their children, demonstrated forms of resistance that history sometimes fails to recognize. They survived. They maintained their humanity in the face of systematic attempts to reduce them to reproductive machinery. They found ways to love their children even when those children would be sold away. They created community among themselves despite efforts to isolate them. They documented their experiences when they could, leaving testimony for future generations. And when freedom came, they spent decades searching for lost children, rebuilding families, creating lives that affirmed the value and dignity they had been denied. That survival, that insistence on humanity in the face of dehumanization is as important to remember as the horror they endured. What happened in the basement was not an aberration, but a logical extension of slavery's premise. Understanding that, confronting the systematic nature of the exploitation rather than dismissing it as the act of individual villains is essential to understanding American history. The legacy of these breeding programs extended far beyond the individuals who directly experienced them, shaping family structures, community bonds, and generational trauma across the descendants of those who survived. The sealed testimony from St. Landry Parish, the fragmentary records preserved in various archives, and the oral histories collected over decades provide evidence of what occurred. But behind that evidence are thousands of individual stories. Women forced to bear children they would lose, children raised to understand themselves as commodities, men coerced into creating families they couldn't protect, and communities torn apart by the systematic application of economic logic to human reproduction. These stories deserve remembering, not to create despair, but to recognize resilience. The survivors of Belmont's breeding program and similar systems across the South didn't just endure. They resisted in countless small ways, maintained their humanity, created beauty and meaning despite systematic attempts to reduce them to economic units. Their descendants, including those still searching genealogical records, trying to piece together family connections severed by systematic breeding programs, carry forward that insistence on dignity and human value. This is the story that the court records from 1934 began to reveal, not just what happened in the basement at Belmore, but why it happened, how it was sustained, who resisted, and what legacy it left. The full accounting continues as historians and descendants work to document what systematic breeding programs meant for the individuals and families who experienced them. The voices of those women preserved in testimony and fragmentary records speak across the decades with a truth that demands acknowledgement. We're more than what was done to us, and our stories will not be erased. What do you think about this dark chapter of American history? How should we remember the thousands of women who endured systematic breeding programs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the realities of American slavery, please like this video and share it with others who need to hear these voices from the past. Subscribe to Circle of Fear 1 for more stories that history tried to bury. These voices deserve to be heard, and these stories need to be told. See you in the next video.